From orbit, Rocky seems quite fascinating. Trouble says the scans he's getting so far reveal the planet slid back into an ice age, probably thanks to the nuclear winter from the last battle down there between the Davions and Steiners. Radiation levels now are fairly tolerable, of course survivable even without protection. There's no shortage of trials and tribulations in the BattleTech universe. However, the interpersonal conflict, drama, and betrayal tends to impact the people involved, independent of the locations and environments where things take place. The tragic story of Rocky and the people that called it home is unique in that the planet itself feels like a character involved in the action. As we'll find out, the planet also suffers the consequences of those actions along with the residents. When the high-powered telescopes on Earth first identified the planet later known as Rocky, there was great excitement. It was the second planet in the 10-planet system, but located in what was referred to as the Goldilocks zone, where liquid water could be present on the surface. As more data was gathered, more and more of the requirements for human habitation were checked off. Even though the star was a relatively cool and low-mass K85 type, Rocky had a tight enough orbit that the equatorial temperature was just slightly lower than Terra's. Rocky's single moon, 64% surface water coverage, multiple continents, and surface gravity of just 3% more than Terra meant the planet was an extremely good candidate for colonization as humanity began to spread beyond the boundaries of the Terran system. After the TAS Pathfinder confirmed that Rocky was rich in both mineral wealth and a good environment for establishment of biological colonization, the race was on to claim a foothold on the planet just 29.8 light-years from Terra. A collection of wealthy investors and corporations concentrated in North America were the first to strike with a series of outposts that claimed choice locations on the planet's 5 major landmasses. These early arrivals left their mark as they named major geological features and their major cities in a way to remind them of home. Across the continents of Cascadia, Columbia, and Appalachia, new arrivals had plenty of places to set up camp, and soon small settlements ringed the planet's equator. Over time, several of the settlements would grow into thriving cities that were well placed to capitalize upon the agricultural products and the mining of high-value metals. To facilitate both industries, there were several local producers of industrial machinery. As the years passed, Rocky became a valuable member of the Terran Alliance trading network, which continued to boost the planet's prospect for future development. The initial settlers on Rocky brought with them the pre-existing power frameworks of their investment conglomerates and business ventures, and it showed in the establishment of a local planetary government. While it was advertised as a democratic system, the reality was that the corporations which ran the planetary industries and the first arrivals who controlled them were the real power in planetary politics. It's been said that the political corruption and economic graft present on Rocky was a microcosm of the larger issues which continually plagued the Terran Alliance during the 22nd through 24th centuries. For a while, the interstellar political machinations within the Terran Alliance didn't have much impact on the residents of Rocky. There were resources to mine, business to conduct, and for the most part the populace was not inclined to become rebellious or demand significant political change. As the planets farthest from Terra in the Alliance began to make more and more noise concerning independence, the rhetoric and propaganda did start to spread to Rocky's major cities. The traditional strong support for any and all policy changes from Terra began to crumble as the planet's power players could see the political ground shifting. When the Outer Reaches rebellion broke out, the government of Rocky was only able to barely hang on and prevent the widespread protests and violence that struck other planets like Freedom, Ride, and Severin. With multiple planets declaring their independence from the taxation and meddling from Terra, Rocky's leadership struggled with remaining staunchly loyal to Terra if it risked an eventual rebellion. As the planets of human-settled space went to war, those old money families who felt they had a lot to risk by staying ended up pulling up their stakes and heading back to Terra. This accelerated as time passed, as it became clear that the Terran Alliance efforts to pummel the upstart rebellious planets into submission was wildly optimistic. When the Demarcation Declaration of 2242 was announced, concern turned to panic as Rocky was now on the outskirts of a vastly reduced sphere of Terran influence. The planet's atmosphere simmered with barely contained conflict as many powerful families took the opportunity to leave. The power vacuum created by their departure led to a rise of populist and common folk politicians who promised reforms that would transition the planet to an actual representative government rather than a corporate oligarchy. While reforms were enacted, the consequences of so many of those old money families and their corporate structures leaving was a significant decline in economic output. In what became a series of compounding factors, reduced population led to fewer trade opportunities, which resulted in job losses, higher unemployment harmed domestic markets, and Rocky was plunged into a deep economic recession. Adding insult to injury, being on the outskirts of patrolled space resulted in a rise of acts of system piracy, which further harmed trade. Requests for aid from Terra to protect shipping lanes went largely unanswered, as the Terran Alliance had bigger problems on their plate. Forced to fend for themselves, Rocky began to build domestic factories for light weaponry. This new spending and investment, using local materials, aided the struggling economy, as well as made the planet less of a desirable target for raiders. Eventually, system-to-system trade was re-established and reinforced, some of which was less than legal considering the Terran Alliance's moratorium on trading outside of the Alliance. Over time, as the Terran Alliance continued to crumble under the weight of its intense internal political conflict, Rocky seemed poised to weather whatever storm might come thanks to this renewed economic strength under new generations of leadership. Sure enough, when the Alliance Civil War broke out in 2314, Rocky played it cool. And when James McKenna took power and declared the creation of the Terran hegemony, Rocky found itself in a position to question where their future loyalties would lay. Initially wary of McKenna's new government, Rocky's leadership hesitated. Only after news arrived of the annexation of Altair and Dairon nearby did it become obvious that there was only one path forward. Reports say that Rocky's government accepted McKenna's terms for joining the new Terran hegemony even before his diplomats arrived on the planet's surface. The consequences for this choice that wasn't really a choice were not well understood at the time. With renewed political and military power, the Terran hegemony was in a position to expand power and control over systems rather than contract. Some of the old money families that had left Rocky decades before returned, expecting that they would reclaim land and positions that had once been abandoned. Of course, those who were now in power and had control of industries that had seen significant upgrades and investment over the years were unwilling to just walk away and return to being in a largely powerless economic underclass. Rocky's municipal buildings and legal systems were slammed with cases brought in by both old and new money elites that sought to outdo each other. What had initially been amusing or a new form of entertainment for the locals gradually became tiresome, as neither the old nor the new money elites seemed very sympathetic to the average mine or factory worker who was expected to clock in and work no matter who owned things. Eventually, the time and money spent arguing over economic and political power led to an erosion of both, as the planet once again slipped into economic hard times. Eventually, the old and new money remembered that what really mattered in life was extracting as much wealth and power as possible, and there was a general reconciliation. Unfortunately for the planet's population, by that time the apathy in the political processes made it easier for a deep corruption to set in. By the time that Michael Cameron became Director General of the Terran hegemony, the politics and economic system on Rocky was as corrupt as ever before in the planet's history. The ruling elite even established a series of old Terran titles and self-granted honors, which further distanced themselves from the rabble over which they ruled. Why does this all sound so familiar? Probably remembering some old book I read or something. Even with all the graft and flat-out thievery, Rocky benefited from the prosperity granted by the stability of the Terran hegemony and eventual Star League. There would still be the ever-present business cycle of booms and recessions, but overall Rocky rolled through the next 300 years in a fairly good place. They continued to produce agricultural, commercial, and industrial materials that were shipped to nearby systems. They even established their own domestic military service units so that the planet didn't have to rely upon the hegemony units shifting in and out on rotation. Political and economic stability gave rise to new sources of economic growth, including tourism and the study of some rather unique local native creatures named Wendigoids, which prowled the cooler regions of the planet. This included the glacial mountain ranges of Appalachia, where skiers could enjoy some fantastic ski runs and then share stories about how they spotted a Wendigoid lurking in the distance or watching from behind a stand of trees as they whizzed by. Rocky's indigenous life forms included a wide range of plants and animals. These were supplemented and sometimes supplanted by the introduction of Terran species that were commonly found in North America. As previously mentioned, the most notable indigenous species was the Wendigoid, which were often described as a close approximation of the xenobiological and mythical Yetis from Terra. Fully grown Wendigoids could reach roughly 2.2 meters tall and weigh up to 110 kilograms. Though not normally considered dangerous, the Wendigoid was omnivorous and a pack hunter. It was not impossible that a wayward hiker or skier could end up disappearing without a trace. The noble Wendigoid aside, the good times would not last forever for Rocky. The Star League had been tremendously profitable for the planet, and when Stefan Amaris carried out his coup and murdered the Camerons, the news was shocking and understandably deeply concerning. Distance from the events on Terra, along with a healthy amount of propaganda and perhaps a sprinkling of self-delusion, convinced the politicians and powerful families on Rocky that they might be dealing with yet another transition of power, much like they had seen with McKenna's coup and the establishment of the Terran hegemony. Betting on Terra, no matter who held control of it, seemed like the better choice. Even though the populace of Rocky was wary and generally opposed Amaris, the planet's leadership went ahead and swore loyalty to him. As the Star League slipped into civil war, Rocky had chosen its side. For a while, this decision seemed to go well for Rocky. Not much changed on the planet as Kerensky's SLDF forces were far from Terra and Amaris' forces weren't really interested in the planet which lacked heavy defense industries. For the most part, Rocky's plans to just keep their heads low and avoid placing themselves in the crosshairs seemed to be working. However, when Amaris' fortunes turned and the SLDF began to close in on the systems surrounding Terra, concerns grew. The citizenry and leadership began to worry about the possibility of facing stern political and even criminal punishment should Kerensky's forces end up the victors. When the Amaris Empire Armed Forces units arrived on Rocky, concern turned to panic, and then panic turned to outright terror when assumptions that the soldiers were there to reinforce the planet against the SLDF turned out to be wrong. Very, very wrong. Instead of protecting the planet from attack, the AEAF began attacking major industrial and commercial centers. Logistics hubs were hit, and then smaller and smaller targets as Amaris units sought to render the planet completely unusable to Kerensky's army. The widespread destruction was systematic in hitting almost every important location on the planet, rendering it completely unable to produce anything or even feed the residents who survived the genocidal rampage. When the industrial, civil, and commercial targets were destroyed, chemical and radiological weapons were deployed over population centers, which caused even more chaos and bloodshed. The people of Rocky had feared the SLDF, but when their dropships arrived on the planet's surface, the beleaguered and starving residents were eager for any form of aid that could be rendered. Estimates suggested that up to 500,000 people died at the hands of the AEAF, and tens of thousands more died from starvation before aid could arrive from the SLDF and the Lyran-funded aid groups. Though the SLDF and the Civil War would move on from Rocky, the effects of Amaris' choices were profound and devastating. The prosperous and largely self-sufficient planet was rendered into a beggar, relying upon food and technology shipments from its neighbors just to stem the tide of starvation. In the following few years, there would be hope of gradually recovering and rebuilding thanks to humanitarian efforts like Jerome Blake's SL Comnet program. Unfortunately, Rocky's troubles were not over. In the years following the retaking of Terra, it was discovered that units of the AEAF had sought refuge on Rocky and were increasingly willing to expose themselves to raid small villages and communities for supplies. Humanitarian aid efforts organized by the SLDF were cut off following the collapse of the Star League. When the lords of the great houses walked away from the table and began to prepare for war, the thought of spending time or resources rebuilding planets devastated by Amaris fell off the radar. The best that Rocky could receive was a contingent of Lyran defenders who showed up as House Steiner sought to lay claim to the planet and many of its neighboring star systems. Those Lyran units unexpectedly ended up having to try and hunt down the remaining AEAF units on the planet, which was a task that seemed impossible with so much rugged, frigid wilderness in which to hide. The effort lasted 4 years before all heck broke loose with the arrival of units loyal to House Davion. As the Great Houses descended into the mindless barbarity of the First Succession War, Rocky was not considered a valuable target. In April of 2788, House Davion forces were tasked with a bold mission to hit the Defiance production lines in a lightning raid on Hesperus. The operation was poorly planned and for various reasons was doomed to fail even before it began. However, when the surviving Davions turned back, they were determined to save face. Their mission had been to sow chaos on Hesperus, but the Lyran-held planets on the way back to safe territory would be a consolation prize. When they landed their dropships on Rocky's surface, they discovered the Lyran defenders were already locked into a desperate conflict with the troublesome RimWorld's army units. Seeing the Davion forces as the greater threat, the Lyrans focused their efforts on repelling the unwelcome third-party player on the planet. The RimWorld army forces used the opportunity to strike at the Lyran command center. Out of desperation and convinced that the RimWorlders were working with the Davions to orchestrate the situation, the Lyrans decided to deploy nuclear weaponry. The suspected AEAF center of operations in the city of Cavingwood was targeted, as well as the Davion landing zone, which was just outside the ruins of the old capital city of Denver. The Davion warships in orbit responded to the escalation with nuclear strikes against Lyran positions. The major settlements were bathed in nuclear fire, and by the time the last of the missiles impacted and the bombs stopped dropping, much of the planet was bathed in poisonous fallout. Some of the Lyran and Davion ground forces were able to escape the planet, and later there would be several plans to evacuate the civilian survivors. However, most of the planet's population would be left to die. The pressing military conflict and the rapidly intensifying shortage of jump and dropships made evacuating millions of people from a world impossible. Millions of people died in the firestorms, and many millions more in the resulting nuclear winter and starvation. The planet's ecosystems collapsed along with all of the existing agriculture. Rocky had been turned from a productive and attractive destination to a dead planet that could not sustain life and could not be salvaged. Rocky's population was recorded to be a little over 2,200 million people in 2765, but following the nuclear strikes, the agricultural collapse, and chaos that was created by starving people doing anything to survive, the population dropped to the tens of thousands. The nuclear winter intensified the cold on Rocky to the point that the remaining animal life was forced to find thin bands of land around the equator where they could squeak out an existence. By the end of the First Succession War, Rocky was recorded as a dead or dying planet, and by the beginning of the Second Succession War, it wasn't even included on interstellar maps of the region. Perhaps it was due to the planet's negligible strategic value, but likely also due to the shame and guilt generated by questions from people who wanted to know what happened. While Rocky was forgotten by military planners and heads of state, rumors of the planet and what might be on it persisted. The presence of RimWorld's army forces that kept fighting instead of just laying low and making their escape led to some to believe that they were defending something. Treasure hunters and curious zealots did make journeys into the system to look for clues to Amaris' lost loot. As it turned out, there was some truth to the rumors. In 3067, the famous archaeologist Brooklyn Stevens returned from an action-packed mission to Rocky in possession of a chalice of Ustunda Kirk, which was a gold object looted from Terra. She had found it within a safe on a ship long frozen in the ice on the frozen planet. At the dawn of the Ilklan era, Rocky remains a largely uninhabited world. There are a couple of settlements, but the population numbers no more than 30,000 people, and the planet still doesn't show up on maps of the region. The ebb and flow of Rocky's glaciers has scattered the remains and ruins of a once lively civilization, and there seems to be little chance of a reversal in the climate short of a sustained terraforming effort. At least the Wendigoids survived, so go Yetis. I knew I had to do this video on Rocky after reading the prologue to The Hunt of Jardine, written by Herbert A. Weiss. The first section of the book describes Brooks Stevens escaping the icy planet with the gold chalice, and it's an exciting way to kick off her adventure. I don't know if Rocky has a future in the grand BattleTech storyline, but it does sound like a great place to have an adventure. Have you heard about Rocky before today, or is it new to you? What planet do you think we should visit next? Let me know in the comments below and we'll see what floats. As always, thank you for coming by today to absorb a little BattleTech lore. It's always a pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you felt the video was worthy and you want to see more nonsense in the future. Thank you to those who have taken the extra step to become channel members and more directly fund this and future creations. This support is what makes things like our new 3D modeled video background you saw today a reality. I really do appreciate it. Until we meet again, take care and go make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.